Okay, guys, and I'm back, and I see you are as well, so that's good. If you have not seen the videos that have come before this, they are in order, and they do tell a story in successive chapters. So we are on chapter 13, and I'm just going to dive in, assuming that you are already familiar with what we're talking about and why. So let's just dive in here and we will get to this chapter, which I think is a very, very interesting chapter, as is the next chapter, which is called Nazis and the New Breed. So we will get into a lot of interesting information in the next two chapters. All right, this is chapter 13, King Arthur and the Luciferian Light. I was there the night the following words were spoken, words that were transcribed and immortalized on the internet by someone who had obtained a tape of that evening's service, albeit an edited tape. I remember it so plainly. I remember the expressions, the hand movements, and even where I was sitting. Rick was the speaker that evening, and the following is the transcript taken from the audio taped session. Bob would fall into a trance as soon as he crossed the South Carolina border, and an incredible prophetic anointing would come upon him. And we're flying along. Bob's talking. All of a sudden, the anointing comes on the airplane, and Bob goes, and he's in it, and he starts prophesying. And believe me, when he hits that anointing, it's a high level. Bob told me many, many years ago, he said, "You're going to be in London on the first day of spring," and I'm going to share briefly what he said. He said the Lord told him that I was Arthur, and he spelled it out, and also author, and he spelled it out again. This is 30 years ago. I believe Bob got this before we even met. He said, "You're going to be in London on the first day of spring, and God's going to show you where a sword is stuck in the rock, and you're supposed to pull the sword out of the rock." And he said, "And then you're going to start the round table." Anyway, I'd forgotten that years ago. Now that is taken straight from an audio tape of the meeting that I was in. I was in that meeting. I heard those words spoken. Now let's take a moment and recap what we have to this point so we don't get tangled in the narrative, because it's very easy to get tangled in this narrative because it is so bizarre. Bob Jones falls into a trance on an airplane just over the South Carolina border. While in the trance, the Lord shows Bob that Joyner will be in London on the first day of spring. While in London, the Lord is going to show Joyner a stone with a sword stuck in it. Joyner is going to pull the sword out of the stone and start the prophetic round table. Now let's continue with the rest of the narrative and continue building the foundation as we move toward the rest of the transcript. 3 years ago, January, when Bob was here for our New Year's Eve meeting, we were sitting in our kitchen. He said, "When you going to London?" And I started thinking, and I said, "I'm going this year." He said, "Yep, probably about the first of spring." I started thinking, and I said, "Bob, I'm going to be there on the very first day of spring." He said, "Yep." You know how he does. Says, "Yep, yep." He says, "How long has it been since I gave you that prophecy?" I said, 5 years. And I went back and counted. I said 5 years since he told me, and I was going to be in there, that told me I was going to be in there. He had told me about the sword and all that. I don't remember exactly when he told me I would be there on the first of spring. I believe it has been about 5 years. I said, "Bob, I think it's been about 5 years. He said, "How many kids you got now?" I said, 5. "And how many times did the Lord lay hands on you?" And I had a visitation when the Lord literally came and laid hands on me 5 times. I thought he had killed me 5 times, but that happened. Yeah, sure it happened. The Lord himself came and laid hands on Rick Joyner 5 times. Joyner thought he killed him 5 times. How many times did the Lord lay hands on you? I said 5. How old is Amber now? Amber is one of his daughters. He said 5. You know, 5. All these 5s are lining up. He said, "Yep, you'll be there on the first of spring, and that will be the time of your commission." as I was sitting there in my hotel room and I had an extraordinary visitation of the Lord. I was carried places by the Lord, given things. I was given 5 things by the Lord in that visitation. It was just one of those deals, you know. I think it was in a lot of ways a commission. Rick Joyner, Signs of the Coming Times. That was the name of that audio. And yes, I was in that room listening to this stuff. Remember it very, very clearly. So to encapsulate what was just spoken, Bob was at MorningStar for the 1995 New Year's Eve service, which I was there for, by the way. Was I? I got to remember now. I believe I was. I had to have been. Okay. Had to remember what year I was there, what year I left, all that stuff. But I do remember this. So to encapsulate what was just spoken, Bob was at MorningStar for the 1995 New Year's Eve service. While there, Bob reminds Joyner of what Bob, had prophesied in the airplane years earlier by asking Joyner when he will be in London. Joyner tells him he is planning to be in London on the first day of spring. Bob subsequently tells Joyner that this will be his commissioning. In other words, Bob tells Joyner that this will be the fulfillment of the earlier prophecy. On this trip, Joyner will draw the sword from the stone and later start the prophetic roundtable. Now, I want you to pay attention to the emphasis on the number 5, as we will be coming back to this a bit later. In the next part of the narrative, which takes place in December 1997, Bob asks Joyner for a second time if it will be in London. I was most definitely there on New Year's Eve in 1997. I know that for a fact. So maybe I remember that part of it because it was also mentioned in the 1995. I can't 100% sure say that I was there then, but I am pretty sure that I was. I definitely was there on New Year's Eve 1997. That is for sure. Yeah. So Joyner tells him he's planning to be in London on the first day of spring. Bob subsequently tells Joyner that this will be his commissioning. In other words, Bob tells Joyner that this will be the fulfillment of the earlier prophecy. On this trip, Joyner will draw the sword from the stone and later start the prophetic round table. Now, I also want you to pay attention to the emphasis on the number 5, as we will be coming back to this a bit later. In the next part of the narrative, which takes place in December 1997, Bob asks Joyner for a second time if he will be in London on the first day of the coming spring, 1998. What a coincidence. He is going to be going to London on the first day of spring. This isn't quite the coincidence that it seems, but let's push on with the narrative. Then Bob comes up again, the other day, and he goes, "You got to be in London on the first day of spring." I'm thinking back. I do go to London this year. It's the first day of spring. How old is Amber? All these 8s start lining up. It's an important trip to London. I will be in London again on the first day of spring, and it's 8, and it's going to be a major beginning for me personally, and for us, as a ministry. I may be belaboring this, but it is imperative that you understand what is being said here to build a foundation for what is to come. According to Joyner, Jones had prophesied sometime in the early 90s that Joyner would be in London on the first day of spring. The Lord would show Joyner a sword in stone. Joyner would draw the sword out. Joyner would start the prophetic round table. Joyner found significance in the fact that all the 5s were lining up. So Bob is at MorningStar for the New Year's Eve service, December 31st, 1994. He reminds Joyner of that prophecy, and coincidentally, Joyner just happens to be going to London for the first day of that coming spring, as if Bob Jones didn't know. We'll look at that. For the first day of the coming spring, March 21st, 1995. So according to Bob's prophecy and what Joyner himself has stated here, Joyner would have pulled the sword from the stone on March 21st, 1994, and started the prophetic round table sometime after that. Now, I don't want to get too far off track here, but I do want to mention this. The Prophetic Round Table met at MorningStar for the first time on December 4th to 5th, 1995. Its purpose, according to Joyner, was to discuss important issues now facing the church in America and to make a common statement about our position concerning those issues. Those in attendance at the first roundtable meeting were Larry Alberts, Paul Kane, Mahesh and Bonnie Chavda, Bobby Connor, Don Cousins, Jack Deere, Reuven and Mary Lou Doran, Don Finto, Francis Frangipane, T.D. Hall, Dudley Hall, Peter Lord, Steve Mansfield, and Bob and Rose Weiner. I mentioned the start of the Prophetic Round Table and those in attendance only as a matter of interest and not as a matter of focus. So at the risk of getting off track, let's return to the narrative. Now, the last part of the recorded tape brings us up to the present, not our present, but present as in the night of the recording. Joyner is speaking here at the New Year's Eve service, December 31st, 1997. And yes, I was most definitely in that service. He informs us, and I say us because I was present that evening, that Bob told him the other day that he, Joyner, was going to be in London again on the first day of spring that year, March 21st, 1998. Joyner confirms that yes, he will be in London on the first day of spring and states that it will be an important trip to London. Then, by way of explanation, he says, I will be in London again on the 1st of spring. Apparently, that date is very important to them. As to the second reason, he states that the 8s are lining up. He mentions this about the 8s because, 1, he will be going in 1998, and 2, because his daughter Amber will be 8 years old. This is significant because Joyner believes that the number 8 is the number of new beginnings. He interprets this to mean that it will be a new beginning for him personally and for the ministry. Now, I realize I have belabored this narrative somewhat, but it is critical to what I am about to show you. When Bob prophesied that Joyner would pull a sword from a stone, he was referring, of course, to King Arthur. That was in reference to the 1995 trip, the one in which Joyner made a point of telling us that all the 5s were adding up, or lining up, rather. According to legend, King Arthur supernaturally removed a mystical sword from a stone that none could draw out save he who was the rightful king. King Arthur then gathered a group of knights who were reportedly the best in the kingdom, and they met encircling a round table in the king's castle. These knights of the Round Table spent years traversing back and forth across Britain in search of the Holy Grail. Now, obviously, Joyner would not have told us this so-called prophecy from Bob Jones if he didn't actually believe it. Therefore, it is safe to assume that he believed himself to be either the real King Arthur, whom legend says will return, or a type and shadow thereof. Now, if we take this at face value, we would have to believe that Joyner stumbled on an actual rock on the first day of spring in 1995, and this rock had a sword embedded in it, which he managed to draw out. Presumably, this would somehow show Joyner's worthiness for the task he was predestined to fulfill. In this case, according to Bob Jones, starting the Prophetic Round Table. Now, I think we can all agree that a literal interpretation of Joyner drawing a sword out of a stone is highly unlikely and a bit preposterous, so I believe it is safe and reasonable to assume that Bob's prophecy to Joyner was meant to be more symbolic than literal. But this was it. But what was it a symbol of, and why the emphasis on the first day of spring? It's been a while since I wrote this. Interestingly enough, this date is the vernal equinox. It is a day celebrated by many esoteric groups and considered to be the Luciferian New Year. Coincidence? Maybe, but you have to realize that Joyner considers, but you have to realize that Joyner seemed to place an inordinate amount of importance on days the occult considers holy. That's a fact. Oddly, many of the conferences seem to coincide with these dates. I was not the only one who noticed this fact during my time at MorningStar. Many had commented on the oddity of it. To further illustrate this point, I took an excerpt from a 2008 Morningstar Prophetic Bulletin. We are close to the birth of something we were created for, that we believe will begin this fall around September 21st. Because of this, we moved our Harvest Conference to begin September 18th and the Worship and Warfare Conference to begin on September 22nd. So September 21st will be the Sunday in between. We will have midnight bonfires, roaming worship and ministry teams, and other events that will create a festival atmosphere that is conducive to members of the body getting to know one another. Many important bonds between them will begin at this event. I know what you're saying. So, notice this new beginning was to fall exactly on the summer solstice. Notice as well that Joyner moved 2 conferences so that this date fell in the middle. Oddly enough, he chose to celebrate this date with midnight bonfires on September 21st, precisely the time and date the summer solstice is celebrated by occult communities through the lighting of the Baal fires. This can't be coincidence. Baal fires, bonfires, similar. Do you not find that coincidental? Very? Yeah, oddly enough, he chose to celebrate this date with midnight bonfires on September 21st, precisely the time and date that the summer solstice is celebrated by occult communities through the lighting of the Baal fires. This can't be coincidence. So returning to our narrative, Joyner was going to be in London on the first day of spring, the vernal equinox, the Luciferian New Year. There he would do something symbolic that represented removing a sword from a stone. So whatever this removal of a sword from a stone signified, it was important that it had to be done on that particular date. It was also significant to Joyner that all 5s were lining up. Remember as well that Joyner claimed to have experienced a visitation where the Lord came and laid hands on him 5 times, each time making him feel as if the Lord had killed him. I posit that Joyner was in London on the Luciferian New Year because he was undergoing an initiation. It is fairly well known that pulling a sword from the stone symbolizes the path Luciferian initiates take toward enlightenment. Let that sink in. It is fairly well known that pulling a sword from the stone symbolizes the path Luciferian initiates take toward enlightenment. And remember, he was there on the vernal equinox. So important to be there on the first of, what was it that he had to be there? The first day of spring. Modern Luciferians' roots are in Gnosticism and the ancient mystery schools. Their belief mainly paralleled that of Theosophy and the New Age. They believe they are born with a divine spark, a sword, within us, that is trapped or imprisoned in the gray matter, stone, of our lower minds. This divine spark is the seed of our own divinity, our godhood, if you will. Those ascending the levels and initiations, the divine spark sword can be released from within, and we can achieve a oneness with the divine, Lucifer, and become gods ourselves. At this stage, we return, metaphorically speaking, to the garden. Yes, they really believe this. The key to awareness and to releasing that spark is through secret gnosis, or knowledge. This freeing knowledge is delivered to us via the ascended masters and messengers of light, demons. Now, lest there be any confusion, let me emphatically state that this divine spark is not the Christian God, but rather Lucifer. One Luciferian puts the concept rather succinctly in the following quote: "We have said that Lucifer came to the world to wake man up, to help him remember his divine origin, the divine origin of his spirit, and to help him free himself from the body, soul in which he is trapped." Gnostic Luciferians seek higher and higher levels of illumination in order to undergo an apotheosis and reach godhood. As an inside, the entire apostolic, as an insider, the entire apostolic and prophetic movement talks incessantly about levels. This concept is not found in scripture, but comes directly from the idea that one must ascend through increasingly more challenging levels on the path to becoming divine. If you have been anywhere near this movement, you will recognize the saying, higher levels, bigger devils. How true that is, but not for the reason they suppose. David Spangler, one of the founding members of the New Age movement and a self-avowed Luciferian, shows us why we, as Christians, cannot depend on traditional Christian definitions anymore. One can say they serve Christ and still be a Luciferian. Christ is the same force. This is a quote from David Spangler. Christ is the same force as Lucifer. Lucifer prepares man for the experience of Christhood. He is the great imitator. He is the great initiator. He is the great initiator. Lucifer works within each of us to bring us to wholeness. As we move into a new age, each of us in some way is brought to that point, which I term the Luciferic initiation, that particular doorway through which the individual must pass if he is to come fully into the presence of his light and wholeness. Lucifer prepares man in all ways for the experience of Christhood. The light that reveals to us the presence of the Christ comes from Lucifer. He is the light giver. He is aptly named the Morning Star. MorningStar Ministries. Of course, no one has done more for Gnostic Luciferianism than Alice Bailey of the Theosophical Society. Sometimes my lips get... Anyway, she started Lucifer Trust, now known as Lucis Trust, the publisher for all UN material. On the Lucis Trust website, Wendy Boyd explains what drawing the sword from the stone is meant to symbolize. Arthur may be likened to sharing a similar role as the Christ principle, Lucifer, in that his presence or appearance is key to unlocking the sword from the stone. In this context, it's representative of the transition from the stuckness of the lower concrete mind to the higher rapier-like speeds of the intuition, giving the great invocation a transformative effect upon the mental plane. So the sword is the divine spark that is trapped within the lower mind, the gray matter represented by the stone. Now this spark, as we have stated earlier, is not divine at all, but demonic in nature. It is the sin nature present within all of us as a result of the fall. Gnostic Luciferians believe that it is this spark that communicates with the eons and the ascended masters, demons. Through this communication, they gain what they believe is sacred knowledge, the wisdom to ascend. This is accomplished through direct connection via trances, mystical experiences, and rituals. Generally, this contact will produce feelings of ecstasy and well-being, which is one reason we should never rely on our emotions or what we feel. Here is another quote by Wendy Boyd of Lucis Trust that further elucidates the symbolism of the sword in the stone. However, the sword, like Excalibur, which was the name of the sword, has still to be pulled from the stone. The concrete boulder of the lower mind, the great invocation, can be seen as the Excalibur that is released from the stone and comes to life for all who apply the will to good to use it. The sword in the stone, waiting to be seized and fulfill its destiny, the promise of paradise regained. And to show you that the sword in the stone symbolism is well known to Gnostics, here is a similar quote from another Gnostic website. The lesson of the sword is an esoteric and sacred instruction. It teaches us by putting our minds to the highest and best putting our minds to its best and let me start that again. The lesson of the sword is an esoteric and sacred instruction. It teaches us that by putting our mind to its highest and best spiritual use, each one of us can pull our sword from the stone and re-enter the Garden of Eden. On Joyner's first trip to London, the trip in which he symbolically withdrew the sword from the stone, he emphasized the number 5. I have hopefully established the fact that in all likelihood, this was a ritual initiation that symbolized ascending through the levels and attaining at one-ment with the divine. It is worth noting that there are 5 major initiations one must pass through on the path to enlightenment. Isn't that fascinating? Benjamin Creme, a student of both Helen Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, and Alice Bailey, founder of the New Age movement, states that the evolutionary journey on which we are engaged is marked off by 5 major points of crisis, major expansions of consciousness, which are the 5 steps to liberation and mastery. These are the 5 planetary initiations which free us from further incarnational experience on this earth. All of the masters have taken these 5 initiations. In another article, Benjamin Creme describes the goal of these 5 initiations. There are a great many minor, but only 5 major planetary initiations. Each one represents a divine stage of integration and at-one-ment reached by the initiate. The goal is achieved when the 5th initiation, the liberated master, stands in full at-one-ment with the monad, his father in heaven, Lucifer. This was an overarching fascination with King Arthur, knights, conquests, and the elusive Holy Grail at MorningStar. This was the latter half of the 90s, and at that time, Joyner was busy trying to defend himself over being knighted by the Knights of Malta. There were whispers of swords being used in men's meeting to knight them, and likewise at the children's meetings. In 2001, Charisma magazine article, a former ministry staffer told the magazine that he got concerned when Joyner began urging friends in the inner circle to be knighted. I never felt at peace about it, the former employee said. It is an elitist club. People started vying for positions so they could be knighted. The ones that were knighted had a special bond with Rick. Everyone present at MorningStar during the late 90s knew about the knighting ceremonies. It was impossible to miss the constant talk and tales and talk about knights and conquests, and equally impossible to miss Rick's animated tales of his induction into the Knights of Malta, which, by the way, it was not the real Knights of Malta. I have spent unbelievable amount of time researching. He is not part of the main Knights of Malta. We will get into that later. So, yeah, they were going around knighting everyone, which was a little bit bizarre. It was impossible to miss the constant talk about knights and conquests, and equally impossible to miss Rick's animated tales of his induction into the Knights of Malta. In fact, Joyner laughed about others being likewise knighted as he had been. He joked that Bobby Connor had been dubbed Sir Bubba, while Mahesh Chavda of All Nations Church had been dubbed Sir Loin. Even then, I wondered why these fables and legends of the Dark Ages were becoming so prevalent in a church which claimed that God was doing a new thing. As if the focus on knighting was not enough, Joyner unashamedly urged us to seek the Holy Grail. In Joyner's report from the Round Table, published on the ministry website, Joyner wrote the following: when the legendary King Arthur called for knights, it was a call for those who would 1. Follow the king, 2. Do exploits, 3. Slay dragons, 4. Find the Holy Grail, which was the cup the Lord used for the Last Supper. I wonder why he had to add that right there, that it was the cup, because that's certainly not what he was talking about. We believe the Lord is putting forth the same call today. Really? Do you really think that the Lord's calling us to follow the king? Well, to follow the Lord, the true God, yes. slay dragons, do exploits. Yeah, not in the way that he is meaning it. We believe the Lord is putting forth the same call today and seeking those who will lay aside everything to follow him, who will do exploits in his name, who will go about seeking the powers of darkness to destroy them, and who will never give up the quest to find the vessel of true communion. So according to his own words, Joyner believed that God was issuing the same call to us as the one King Arthur issued to his Knights of the Round Table. Now let's think about that for a minute. Why do you suppose Joyner was so quick to explain that the Grail was the cup Jesus used at the Last Supper? Why would he feel the need to explain this? Wouldn't most people just assume he was referring to the cup? Well, of course they would. He emphasized the fact that the Grail was a cup because it was a coded message not meant for the uninitiated. He was not referring to a cup at all. If he had been, then what he said would have made no sense. Think about it. Why would that cup be any more holy than, say, the cross on which Christ died, or the linen they wrapped his body in after death, or the nails that pierced his hands and feet, or his seamless robe? Why would this vessel be so worthy of the centuries-old quest to obtain it? Furthermore, there's a whole lot of ducks out there. Furthermore, why would Joyner equate finding this cup with true communion? Could it be that the Holy Grail he was referring to was something else? Something far more arcane and mystical? It is well known among occultists that Arthurian Grail romances are Gnostic and Kabbalistic teachings disguised as tales of knightly quests. They were disguised because the Catholic Church they needed to disguise their tales of Gnosticism and mysticism, and they described it in tales such as King Arthur. Yes, and other Kabbalistic teachings, disguised as tales of knightly quests. By concealing the secret knowledge in myths and legends, the keepers of this ancient knowledge were able to pass on heretical doctrines without arousing the suspicions of the Catholic Church. By concealing the secret, those adepts initiated into the Luciferian light, having attained what the New Age refers to as Christ consciousness, avoided being hung or burned as heretics. This so-called Christ consciousness has nothing to do with serving Christ, but rather with becoming Christ. This was the original lie whispered to Eve in the garden by the serpent. Her eyes would be opened, she would be illuminated, and she would become like God. Incidentally, this is the same lie being whispered today. One New Age teacher put it quite succinctly. Ultimately, what we are dealing with here are the many gradients of higher consciousness. To find the Grail is to reach the higher stages of consciousness. The highest human stage of consciousness in Western terms is Christ consciousness. That is the Grail he wanted us to seek. Certainly, Joyner was not telling us to search for the actual cup. That would be ridiculous. After all, the real vessel that Christ drank from has never been associated with true communion. It has always been related to profound mysticism, alchemy, Gnosticism, and the occult. The process of Luciferic enlightenment, symbolized by the quest for the Holy Grail, is at the heart of all esoteric doctrine. It is interesting to note that Hitler, as one deeply steeped in Luciferian doctrine, was obsessed with King Arthur and the Grail lore. He fancied himself to be King Arthur and his aristocracy, and his aristocracy, the Knights of the Holy Grail. It is well documented that Hitler underwent a Luciferic initiation under the tutelage of his special mentor, Dietrich Eckart. Meister Eckhart is quoted as saying, "I shall have influenced history more than any other German. Follow Hitler. I have initiated him into the secret doctrine, opened his centers of vision, and given him the means to communicate with the powers." In the book, Hitler and the New Age, author Bob Rosio explains that Hitler underwent a Luciferic initiation. He established communication with Lucifer, from whom he openly coveted possession. entering the service of Satan through a Luciferic initiation. I firmly maintain that Joyner has likewise gone through a Luciferic initiation. First of all, if you dig deep enough into his own writings and things he has publicly stated, it becomes increasingly evident what he believes. However, there is another reason I so firmly maintain this. At one point, near the end of my time at MorningStar, I happened to have a conversation with a friend, Cynthia. She had been very close to the Joyners and had at one point been a nanny to their children. She had an interesting history, and there are still far more questions about who she was and how she ended up at MorningStar than I will ever have answered. She was found dead at her home in Virginia in 2009 at the age of 52. I have never heard the cause of death. During my days at MorningStar, Cynthia had mentioned to me that her husband was in prison. She disclosed to me that Joyner believed her husband to be the biggest false prophet in America and one of the most dangerous. I had questioned her about this. Surely it was a gross exaggeration on Joyner's part, but she assured me it was not. She also added that her husband had connections to some very dangerous people. I asked her several more questions, but it was clear she was uncomfortable, so I let it go. I didn't know her well enough at that point to determine whether she was a liar or just plain crazy. As it turns out, she was neither. After I had known her a while, Cynthia revealed to me that her husband had been the subject of numerous chick tracts. I used to love those little cartoon tracts, so it piqued my interest. In the 70s and 80s, American publisher Jack T. Chick published numerous short evangelical cartoon booklets in the form of tracts. These were hugely popular at the time and came to be known as chick tracts. Christians would buy these tracts as a witnessing tool and leave them on restaurant tables, bus stations, trains, phone booths, and wherever else they found to leave them. Year after year, years after my time at MorningStar, someone inadvertently sent me an article about a man named John Todd Collins. The article mentioned that he had been the subject of several chick tracts. It eventually clicked. All the bits and pieces Cynthia had told me fell into place with a sickening thud. This was who she had been married to. This was the man Joyner claimed was the most dangerous false prophet in America. John Todd, also known as John Todd Collins, was a relatively well-known speaker who made the rounds in fundamental circles in the 70s and 80s. He claimed to be a former occultist born into one of the top 10 Illuminati bloodlines. Collins is, in fact, one of the top Illuminati bloodlines, indeed. He claimed to be a former occultist born into one of the top 10 Illuminati bloodlines before converting to Christianity. Once converted, he became very popular among both fundamentalist and conspiracy theorists. He actively spoke out against the Illuminati, Christian rock, Catholicism, neo-paganism. Eventually, he went to prison on rape charges he vehemently denied. He claimed he had been set up, but there seemed to be a tremendous amount of evidence against him. I don't know. It is not my intention to defend or accuse John Todd. I just don't know enough about the facts to intelligently comment one way or the other. The official story claims he was released from prison in 2004 into the care of the Behavioral Disorder Treatment Unit run by the South Carolina Department of Mental Health. According to their records, he died in their care in 2007. Todd would have only been 52 years of age. And that's interesting. I just realized that that was the exact same age that his wife Cynthia died. In many conspiracy circles, it is believed he was killed deliberately while in the care of the prison system in 1979. However, that cannot possibly be true. John Todd was certainly alive during my time at MorningStar in the late 1990s. Some conspiracy theorists have claimed he was killed and replaced in 1979, but that is just too bizarre for me to seriously consider. Whatever the story, Todd was clearly a fascinating and colorful character who, even in his death, continues to stir a great deal of controversy in conspiracy circles. Once I had made the connection between John Todd and Cynthia, it became unfathomable to me how the wife of a man who claimed to be a former high-level occultist came to be Rick Joyner's nanny. If Joyner had truly considered John Todd to be the most dangerous false prophet in America, why did he trust his wife to be his children's nanny? Interestingly enough, I later found out that Cynthia had married John Todd while he was in prison. John Todd's former wife had reportedly divorced him prior to his incarceration. The whole thing seemed odd, but then everything at MorningStar was odd. MorningStar could bend and warp your mind if you let it. It was from Cynthia that I gleaned the information regarding Joyner's initiation into the Luciferian light. She shared the information with Dan and I while we enjoyed some downtime in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She seemed genuinely troubled and eventually began to talk about what was bothering her. Hesitantly, she disclosed to us that recently, while visiting at Joyner's home, Julie had shown her a sequin dress she was planning on wearing to a special event. After showing her the dress, Julie asked her advice on what earrings she thought would look best with the dress. Cynthia confessed to us that she had been surprised at Julia's dress choice. The dress was out of character for Julie and most definitely out of place for the backwoods mountain community of Moravian Falls. Cynthia told Julie she thought it was beautiful, but asked where she planned on wearing it. Julie smiled sweetly and motioned toward an invitation on the table. Cynthia looked at the card and was shocked to find out it contained an invitation for Rick and Julie to be initiated into the Luciferian light. When Cynthia questioned it, Julie hastily explained that it didn't mean what she thought it meant, that Luciferian did not mean it had anything to do with Satan, that it just meant light, knowledge, and illumination. It brings entirely new meaning to the name MorningStar Ministry, doesn't it? The initiation into the Luciferian light was to take place somewhere in Europe. I always thought I remember her saying that it was to be held in Great Britain, which of course is where London is located. But then I begin to question myself as to whether I remember that detail correctly. So I don't know for certain, but one thing is sure. Cynthia had been very troubled by seeing the invitation, very troubled indeed. She was, however, unwilling to accept what it really meant. She would not allow herself to even consider the fact that Joyners might not be who and what they said they were. She eventually left MorningStar, but to my knowledge, MorningStar never really left her. Now, I think I'm going to leave it there because this is quite taxing on me emotionally, even just reading this and remembering everything. So I am going to leave it there for tonight. The next one is a heavy chapter, and that is why, and it's a long chapter, so it will need its own program. And it is a very, very, well, wait. There is the Nazis and the New Breed, and then that's a long chapter, and so is chapter 15, the Knights of Malta. So excuse me, not sure where that came from. So I think I'll leave it there. The chapter on the Nazis and the New Breed is a long one and very detailed, so I would like to be fresh as a daisy when I read that, and I'm definitely not. So there we go. We will stop there for this evening, and I will pick up, and you are not going to want to miss the part on the Nazis, nor if you are or were part of Rick Joyner or any of that ilk, the prophetic and apostolic movement. You're going to want to hear this about the Nazis. You'll also want to hear about this about the Knights of Malta, because there is quite the story there. Quite the story indeed. So that's going to be it for tonight. I love you guys. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. And like always, any questions you have, put them in the comments. I will gather those comments when I get back from vacation, and I will address them if well, unless I think you're just wanting to argue, because this movement does draw that. So if you're really wanting to know something and the answer to something, or you're confused about something, I will most certainly answer it. All right, so that's that, and I will see you in the next video. Good night, guys.